Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm Go Local News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning back in after Go Local CEO Josh Fenton welcomed in Central Falls Mayor James Diossa. We're going to stick on the theme of politics. I've got Brown Professor of Political Science. I've got Corey Brettschneider. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I appreciate it. You're on the tour for the new book, The Oath in the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents.
Yeah.
Did Morning Joe this morning?
I did, yeah.
And
Dan York just now.
Going national, going local here at Brown
Yep.
University, and have worked closely with someone that Go Local checks in every week with Jennifer Lawless.
Yeah, shout out to Jennifer Lawless, and I don't know if anybody remembers, but I was her campaign treasurer.
Cut your teeth back in the day, back in, was it 06?
Yep, that's
Okay,
right.
she
Yeah.
just had the piece up with her primary defeat back then, but always appreciate picking her brain and subsequently having you in to talk about the book.
Nice.
When did you decide that this book needed to be written, and when did you start writing it?
I wrote a piece for Politico called Trump versus the Constitution, a Guide, and it had a simple structure. It went through Trump's various proposals at the time, from the Muslim ban to the proposal to torture the families of suspected terrorists, the families that was, not the actual suspected terrorists, and went through, including his also hostility that was evident then about free speech and threatening to change the libel laws, and just talked about how each of those proposals violated a different provision of the Constitution. And then the thought was, you know what, I need to do something that's not just about this president, and that gives also hope for the future and thinks about the big picture.
Now you said not just for this president, as you said, being predictive. Do you take a look at other administrations?
Yeah, it's a book that looks at three areas. The idea from the beginning in George Washington's second inaugural that the job of the president is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That's in Article 2. The president says that the first few seconds in office. And what's significant about George Washington, although we're probably sick of hearing about him, when you really look at what he said, it's a guide for today. He says, I just took the oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but if I violated it, then subject me to not only criticism, but to constitutional punishment. And he's speaking to a small group of congresspeople in Philadelphia, but I think to me, what I say in the book, is he's speaking to us right now.
So why do you think then, pointing out all these transgressions of the Trump administration and the Constitution, that it's not held to the same George Washington standard?
The standards of the Constitution have eroded over time. It's certainly not just Trump, although this is a huge offense to the Constitution in the Muslim ban, in the various proposals that I mentioned. But there have been other offenders as well. So Woodrow Wilson expanded the presidency. He really gave constitutional place to the idea of the bully pulpit. And he used it for bad effect. He is quoted at length in Birth of a Nation, a movie, the first film, to celebrate the Ku Klux Klan. And rather than disown his statements, even though they were so at odds with the idea of equal protection, the idea of non-discrimination based on race, he shows that film in the White House, expanding the presidency, creating the bully pulpit into a constitutional idea beyond what Teddy Roosevelt had done with it, and doing it at odds, really, with Washington's vision. So it's not that this is the only president to offend the Constitution. It's a big one, especially in recent years, but there have been others as well.
So you call it in the subheader, the Guide for Future Presidents. I mean, talk with us about that how-to. Is it just sort of a reminder of the tenets of the Constitution, or is it even more practical than that?
I mean, part of the idea is that if you want to run for president of the United States, this is the basics of what you need to know, and it's beyond the basics. It's stories and principles and ideas, but written in a very clear way so anybody could really understand it, even seniors in high school. The bar is low, so there are a lot of people who might think that they could be president right now. But it's also a guide for voters. And we're not all going to run for president, but we are all going to hopefully vote for one. And so this is a way of basically restoring the idea that when we vote for a president, when we vote for Congress, the first thing we have to care about is the office and the limits that the Constitution guarantees.
Now, I'm assuming here, and you'll have to fill us in, talking about this Guide for Future Presidents. Does this book touch upon, and if it doesn't, let's talk about the use of the Constitution looking at the office of the presidency in itself, which is a very popular topic right now.
Yeah, it certainly does. It focuses from the beginning on the idea that a president has to not just respect the Constitution, but the job description in Article 2 is to go beyond what the courts require, but to really defend it, to articulate it, and to give a vision in defense of it. And that means when for instance, we talk about the obligation of a president to respect the ability to criticize a president, the free speech clause, the equal protection clause, it's a criticism, the whole chapter of the Muslim ban. And then the last third is really on point for today because it's about how to stop a president who disregards the oath. And the topics there are impeachment, of course, but also things that people might not have thought about. So the right of a special prosecutor, for instance, to indict a sitting president. People have disagreed about that, but I take a strong position that there is a constitutional right to indict a sitting president and to try and even convict one. And then another thing people might have not thought about, but is given the theme of Go Local, it's about the role of the states in refusing to obey, a legal way of refusing to obey executive orders that violate the Constitution. So I defend and tell the story of somebody in California, Miguel Marquez, who's refusing the president's order that says that local police have to comply and cooperate with ICE by holding people arrested for parking tickets for 48 hours. And it's about why the 10th Amendment gives them the right to resist. And that includes Rhode Island or really any locality.
So when was this book finished?
I finished it, I guess, in June, and it's out now. But I can't say that I'm surprised by what's happening. I wrote it because I thought that when you have a president who is so hostile to the idea of not just the oath, but the rule of law, and whose instinct really seems to be about aggrandizing his own power rather than respecting the rule of law, that we're headed for a constitutional crisis. And that's where we are literally today, right now.
Well, I'm going to be certainly talking with Jennifer Lawless down at UVA about Brett Kavanaugh and where things stand there.
Yeah.
What's your sense with folks who have talked about his nomination as being a litmus test from the president to knowing that if he has that seat, that it will not be used against him?
I think it's a very real concern. I wrote a piece for Politico that Senator Coons from Maryland entered into the from Delaware, entered into the congressional record. It's called Brett Kavanaugh's Radical View of Executive Power. And it's why even this terrific case, U.S. v. Nixon, about the limits on a president, about the limits on presidential privilege, that said that Richard Nixon had to turn over the Watergate tapes to the special prosecutor. My argument is that's a fundamental case that we need to care about right now, and Brett Kavanaugh doesn't respect it.
Well, it's interesting given all the attention and scrutiny that's paid on other areas of Brett Kavanaugh's qualifications and none pertaining at this time, it seems, to some of the important questions. Now, Jennifer Lawless last week was under the impression, and she made the prediction, that he might not make it through the nomination process. Do you think all of this other stuff that comes to light and that clearly the press and the public are paying attention to will have an impact?
Look, my view is we have to take a step back and ask what the right standard is for evaluating him. And this is not a criminal trial. He doesn't have a right to be found not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As in a criminal trial, certainly he would, or anybody would, accused of it. This is about whether or not we're going to appoint somebody for life to the most important job, the fifth swing justice, the Supreme Court of the United States. And my view is nobody has a right to be a Supreme Court justice, and the standard has to be whether or not these credible allegations, whether there's a reasonable suspicion that they're right, and if they are right, then he certainly should not be confirmed. And these other issues that I've raised as well about his radical view of executive power that would protect Trump from the Mueller investigation, actually that's enough too to vote no.
Well, interesting. All eyes are on D.C., but all eyes are on you and your book right now. Again, you're on this media trial, and you'll be in Providence tonight.
Yeah, I'm going to be at the Point Street readings. If you want to come and join us, I'd love to see people there. I'm going to be signing books as well.
Now, I'm assuming this is a required reading for students at Brown?
Actually, Kirkus, the review, Kirkus said when it first came out, this is a vital reading for all Americans. That's a quote. So not just students at Brown, but for all Americans everywhere in the country. And maybe check it out if you're around the world too, because the president has a lot of power in foreign policy.
Well, again, as all eyes are on the U.S. and what's taking place, sounds like it could be a good primer for the rest of the world as well. Well, I appreciate it. Corey Brettschneider, professor of political science at Brown University. Thank you so much for taking the time to come in. Don't go anywhere. We're going to go from politics to tech here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.